Hello, I'm Dennis Peterson, and I'd like to welcome you to this session of Unlocking the Mysteries of Creation. This is the 7th in a series of 12 sessions where we'll be looking at all sorts of exciting things that help us to understand better the origin of everything in the universe. Now, in this session, we're going to be looking at the subject of dinosaurs, and particularly how dinosaurs relate to man. Now, I picked up a little booklet in a supermarket some time back, and if you can see this, it says dinosaurs, prehistoric animals, and it's a very colorful little thing. And I looked inside, and immediately, what did I see? Right inside the front cover, the very first thing, the evolution, the story of life. And you see the chart there that's so typical, similar to what we've seen before. Reading on the first page, I was rather interested in this statement. It's unbelievable that the first one-celled animals eventually developed over millions of years into beasts such as giant tyrannosaurs, saber-toothed tigers, and us human beings. Well, they got that right. It's unbelievable. But then it goes on and it says, the chart next to this page will show you how the animal kingdom grew and expanded into all sorts of amazing shapes and sizes. And then I looked at the chart. I wondered, well, there's starfish, spiders, insects, variety of dinosaurs, saber-toothed tigers, there's man up at the top. But there's no way that that chart can show me how the animal kingdom grew into all these amazing shapes and sizes. I began to realize as I read through this little booklet that evolution takes up most of the first third of it. And then they finally get talking about dinosaurs. But when you consider the subject of the dinosaurs, we can't help but recognize that that's probably one of the most popular themes that people draw attention to nowadays. In fact, you probably know some little boys that collect dinosaurs. And maybe you collect them, and that's quite all right. They've got all sorts of wonderful things that you can collect that help us to understand more about these amazing creatures. My son, probably the first big word that he ever learned was the word dinosaur. And I remember when I was about 10 years old collecting them myself. And I still collect them. And they're a lot of fun. They're fascinating. When we were privileged to go to Canada and visit the Calgary Zoo in Alberta, Canada, we stopped in and noticed that they had a tremendous new section called the Prehistoric Park. And on the way into that section, where there are life-size replicas of dinosaurs, I was particularly aware of a very special sign. Notice this. It says, the dinosaurs reigned for 140 million years. They mysteriously became extinct about 60 million years before man appeared on Earth. Now that sounds pretty typical, doesn't it? When most of us think about the dinosaurs, we tend to think that they died out millions of years before man was ever around. But we've got to remember that that millions of years has been a fabrication of evolutionary thinking that's been drilled at us over and over and over again. Repetitious, yes. Say it enough times, people do believe it, but where's the evidence for it? Now, in our studies together, we've looked at evidence to indicate that there may be a whole different story to understand the time frame. And if God did create all the animals to be under the dominion of man, then that puts everything in a different perspective, particularly dinosaurs. But why should we say that dinosaurs must have died millions of years ago just because we don't see great lumbering beasts like Triceratops, for example, running around in people's backyards today? Now, these animals were pretty amazing. You look at these creatures and realize that they were as big as a U-Haul truck. Some of them weighed up to 24,000 pounds. Just the skull bone alone of a Triceratops was about 8 feet long from that big horn collar all the way to its snout. These huge spikes on its head, some of them 4 or 5 feet long, 6 feet long maybe. You know what? That animal, when we look at it, we kind of admire it in a way. It's rather striking. Just the same, I don't know if I'd want to run into one on a moonlight hike in the bush country. But then there's TR coming over the hill, and up at the Calgary Zoo, you see this marvelous display of this threatening-looking dinosaur that we call Tyrannosaurus rex. Now, we're told that he was a real meanie because he had a 4-foot-long jaw studded with teeth about 6 inches long apiece. Now, it's interesting that we look at all of these creatures and we see they've got all sorts of strange names, strange shapes. They're all pretty big, but some of the dinosaurs are actually quite small. Realize that dinosaurs have indeed been found. Their bones on every continent of the earth, some kind or another of dinosaur. They've been given all sorts of strange names. The scientists have given them these names, of course. And they're a little hard to pronounce at times, but if you ever have any trouble, you might consider asking a 10-year-old boy. They often know the names and how they're pronounced. But we look at these pictures in the museums, the books that come out, the various programs about dinosaurs. Some of them are so large that it makes a family of humans look very small by contrast. But you wonder, what is the story, the real story, about dinosaurs? Their bones are found in the layers of the earth. Those layers have been deposited by water. Those bones are taken to museum laboratories around the world, cleaned up, carefully prepared, and put in exhibits like this one. But when you consider the dinosaurs, I'd like us to think of a very interesting possibility. Can you just imagine, could dinosaurs have been seen alive by human beings? Now, you better be careful. When you ask that kind of a question to some people, they might accuse you of watching the Flintstones too much lately. I asked one man, and he just figured that dinosaurs had lived with man all the time. He didn't seem to have any problem with that. And I inquired a little further, and he said he read it in the newspapers. And of course, he was referring to cartoons like Alley-Oop that he had read since he was a child. And even though that concept is understandably a fairy tale, most people, we realize today, have this idea ingrained into their thinking that dinosaurs are separated from humans by millions of years. But consider this. A man lived 4,000 years ago, just a few hundred years following the flood. His name was Job. Job had a very unique experience in that God spoke to him out loud and described some things to help Job understand the nature of God. Now, how did God describe his nature? He brought Job's attention to some of his creation. Now, that's exactly what you'd expect. What did we read from Romans chapter 1, verse 20? The things that are made declare God's nature. But in Job chapter 40, we read about one particular creation of God. There it says, "Behold now, behemoth, which I made with thee." Now, what is a behemoth? Many reference Bibles will show in the margin that a behemoth might be an elephant. Others might say that a behemoth might be a hippopotamus. Now, we don't know for sure what it was because the ancient Hebrew word behemoth has no absolute modern translation. But the description that's given in the text by God himself may give us some idea of what it is that Job was able to behold. It says, "He eats grass like an ox." Well, it could have been an elephant because an elephant certainly eats grass, eats vegetation. But it goes on and says, "His strength is in his loins," or in his hips. Apparently, it must have had powerful legs. It goes on and says, his force is in his stomach muscles or in his belly. You know, it must have had a powerful midsection. But then it goes on a little further. If that was all the information we'd have to go on, we could well assume that it might be a hippo or an elephant. But there's more information. God says, he moves his tail like a cedar tree. Now we've got a problem. Have you ever noticed the tail of an elephant doesn't fit that description at all? But of course, God didn't say that he was talking about an elephant. He said he was talking about a behemoth. Now you just think for a minute. What are the kinds of creatures, big creatures that we know of, could God have been describing to Job as he looked on? Well, a rhinoceros is a pretty heavy hauler, but his tail isn't much to talk about at all. You probably never thought you'd see that end of a rhino today. I hope you appreciate the trouble I had to go to get that picture. But there's more information still as we read what God had to say about this awesome creature. Now, with a tail like that, can you just imagine what an animal of that kind would have looked like and demonstrated as you watched it moving across the ground? God says, his bones are like beams of bronze. His bones are like bars of iron. He is the chief of the ways of God. Now you look at the bones that are found in museums, and they are big and powerful. And you look at these huge animals and the different parts of their bodies, and they truly are a tremendous example of the awesome power of God demonstrated in the animal kingdom. If it was a dinosaur type of creature, you could say this certainly was an animal representing the chief of the ways of God. But then the next logical question that we would have to ask is, could this animal have ever been seen alive to leave evidence behind? I mean, solid, hard evidence. Have we ever found anything that would prove that man and dinosaurs existed on this earth at the same time? There's a river in Texas called the Paluxy River. And for many, many years, most of this century in fact, it has been known that dinosaur foot tracks have been found fossilized in the riverbed. Here you're seeing a picture of part of the riverbed that has been blocked off by sandbags. Frequently, men have gone in there and examined these foot tracks, and there are many of them that clearly show us that dinosaurs walked across these flat strata of limestone rock. Now, of course, the rock would have been mud at one time in the past, and the footprints were made, and then somehow it hardened. We don't even know exactly how that whole process works. But one thing is clear. It had to happen rapidly and in conditions that were very different from what we see happening today. But for many years, not only have dinosaur tracks been recognized there at the Paluxy River, but even other things as well. As this sign on nearby property attests, not only dinosaur tracks are found, but human tracks, even giant man tracks, are found fossilized in the same limestone rock as where the dinosaur tracks are found. Some of them are so close, they're right next to each other. Now, they've been found for years, and the skeptics have insisted, well, this just could not be. These human-looking tracks, the skeptics said, must be the creative work of ancient Indian carvers. Now, it's funny they never said that about the dinosaur tracks. Why would they say that about the human tracks? Well, because you can't have human tracks beside dinosaur tracks in the same rock strata. Why not? Well, because this chart insists that dinosaurs died out millions of years before mankind ever lived on the earth. And remember, the chart was totally devised based on the theories of evolution over 150 years ago, but not on solid evidence that we know to be true scientifically. An article in National Geographic in 1954 was featured called, "We Captured a Live Brontosaur." Now, they didn't really, but they were talking about these same Texas-sized foot tracks that some people find big enough to take a bath in. They sandbanked a whole section of river, uncovering many foot tracks. And then they got in and took out huge slabs of rock and shipped them all the way to New York City, where they were installed in the dinosaur exhibition in the Natural History Museum. The men who were responsible for that expedition knew full well about these mysterious human-looking tracks. I've seen their notes. They even made notations indicating about these giant tracks. But not a word was said in the magazine article. Not a word was said in the Natural History Museum. Why not? You'd think that even if they didn't want to admit that they were human, they would have at least brought out the information for the mystery and for all of the intrigue that it would cause. Human-looking tracks found with dinosaur tracks. Imagine. There have been many tracks like those found at the Paluxy River over the years, and many more continue to be found. As they are, we see continually evidence that makes them look very human. Now, a few years ago, there was some reports that were circulating indicating that these certainly cannot be human at all, and even some of the creation scientists have backed off the issue entirely. Well, at that time, I had spent only one trip to the Paluxy River. It was about 15 years ago. In fact, that first trip, when I spoke to a man who was a ranger there at the state park where they preserved a section of the river so that these dinosaur tracks would be preserved, I asked the ranger, "What's this I hear about human tracks?" And he said, "We don't know anything about any human tracks." It's funny, he didn't know anything about them. Everybody in town knew about them, but not a thing was said. Not by him, anyway. Well, recently, I have been to the Paluxy River 7 times since these reports were circulating in the later 1980s that the creationists even were backing off the issue. And it's a whole different story when you are there and see for yourself what's going on. You see, for a while, people were saying they found that there's actually stains on the front of these human-looking tracks that are very decidedly dinosaur. And so whatever that human-looking imprint is, it certainly couldn't be human. I've investigated the very tracks that they were talking about regarding those stains. And it looks very much like those tracks are actually double tracks, where there are human footprints inside of dinosaur footprints. And a whole sequence of those can be seen. They're underwater most of the time. A couple of years ago, in the late summer, the first time in 40 years, the river was so dry that those tracks were exposed. And you could actually go out there and examine them and make castings of them. And that was done. And in sequence, for nearly a dozen tracks, there was clear evidence that these are very much double tracks of both human and dinosaur. But this is not the only sequence. There are many tracks. Over 120 tracks of human-looking footprints have been found there at the Paluxy River over the years. We'd like to talk more about the Paluxy River, and we'll do that in our next session in this series. But I'd like to consider some more interesting information about the existence of dinosaurs and mankind on Earth in the past. When you look at some of the models that they've made of the dinosaurs, you can't help but wonder, what about all of those legends that we've heard about sea monsters and dragons and reptilian beasts of tremendous size that have been seen by ancient peoples of the past? From China to South America to Africa, peoples from around the world hand down traditions that they actually have seen these kinds of creatures. Of course, they've doctored up the stories with all sorts of fanciful ideas, but is it possible that these various peoples from diverse parts of the world could have all made up the same theme independently? Or is it more likely that these kinds of giant reptilian beasts were in fact seen by earliest mankind following the flood. Now, I'd like to draw your attention again to that ancient record in the Bible that was written just 300 years following the flood, Job. And in the 41st chapter, Job speaks about another animal. Actually, it's God speaking to Job. Here it's recorded in the 41st chapter. It starts out, "Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook?" Now, Leviathan, what's that? Well, it's always been known as a fierce sea creature. We don't know for sure what the word means, but many translations and many Bible references will say that this is an alligator. Does that look like what this could be? And you look at the descriptions and it seems like something a whole lot more fierce than an alligator. Alligators can't even do some of the things that are described in this passage. Most notably, get down to the 19th verse. And we read in Job chapter 41, "Out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils goeth smoke as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth." About now, some of us would probably like to say, "God, did you have to say that?" As if we're embarrassed for God. But God doesn't seem to make any apology about it. In fact, he reiterates this fact in several ways, that fire, smoke, came out of his mouth. Out of a creature? Is that possible? Consider some of the creatures, strange as they are, that exist on the earth today. Think, for example, of living lights. You know, like fireflies. Have you ever seen a firefly? Of course, most people today, especially in North America, have seen fireflies. They're not existing in some parts of the desert regions or on the West Coast, but in other parts of the country, they're commonplace. Let me ask you this. What if all the fireflies became extinct millions of years ago? No, not millions of years ago. What if they became extinct at the time of the flood? Just a few thousand years ago. What if they've never been seen by modern man? What if nobody had heard about them, nobody had ever read about them, nobody knew anything about them, and then one day you turned up some ancient diary, 4,000 years old, where a man had written about a bug that lights up? You know what they'd say? Just like what you'd say, well, that's got to be some kind of a myth. I mean, bugs don't light up. We know that. Nothing like that exists. I think we get the point. I was once in the jungles of southern Mexico, and I saw a firefly. It was a very large variety, about as big as a bumblebee. And I just noticed off to my side, it came flying along, and it started buzzing, and I heard it, and I turned aside, and it flicked its light on. Now, fireflies have tail lights. They don't have headlights. And the tail light stayed on as it continued to fly on in front of me, and about 20 feet away, then it flicked off again. It was about as bright as one of these little twinkle lights on our Christmas tree. And I was absolutely amazed. A bug that lights up. Well, there are other animals that do some rather amazing things too. Consider the bombardier beetle. We talked about that in an earlier session. Here's a bug that literally has a blast. A bug that produces an explosion chemically as hot as boiling water. The bombardier beetle is common today. What if they had all become extinct several thousand years ago? Nobody ever saw one of those either. Again, we get the point. There are some pretty amazing creatures out there. Just because we've never seen one, does that mean that we should doubt a description of one that existed several thousand years ago? Consider an electric eel. I looked it up in the encyclopedia, and to my utter amazement found out that an electric eel can deliver a shock of up to 600 volts. Now that's quite a bit. Again, if electric eels had all become extinct, maybe several thousand years ago, and somebody tried to tell us that there's actually an animal that can deliver 600 volts of electricity, come on. there are skull bones of some of the dinosaur types that have some very strange breathing passages. We don't know what exactly they were for, but we recognize that dinosaurs, like other large creatures, have a stomach that produces methane gas. And we recognize that it would be perfectly possible for a good belch to produce fire coming out if there was something to light it. Now, just because we don't know the mechanism to cause the flames or the smoke to come out of an animal's mouth, does that mean that we must write it off and say it could never have existed? And then what do you do with a discovery made in 1977 off the coast of New Zealand? A Japanese fishing crew hauled into their nets an absolutely amazing catch. It was 4,000 pounds in weight, about 30 feet long, and they knew it was no tuna. You look at this thing and you recognize exactly what the Japanese fishermen recognized. This was a creature that we would call a plesiosaurus. In fact, the Japanese government even published a commemorative stamp to honor their people for having discovered a recently living plesiosaurus. Now, why is it that that thing has not been publicized in North America very much? Oh, you can find some obscure articles here and there, but generally it's not known. The animals we call plesiosaurus, the museums tell us, became extinct 65 million years ago. Is it possible that there could be creatures like that that exist today, still living? And then what do you do with the Loch Ness Monster? I know people have said all sorts of things about that. The Loch Ness Monster has been seen over the last 1,400 years by over 3,000 people. And the people in Scotland believe that there is a family of these large animals living in this deep lake called Lake Ness. They think that they're creatures that's something like a plesiosaurus type of creature. Now, consider if you one day went for a walk in the woods and bumped face to face into a 15 or 20 foot long dragon. I mean, that'd be pretty shocking. Did you realize that there is such a creature on this earth today? It wasn't discovered until the year 1912. On the South Pacific island of Komodo, 1,000 creatures called the Komodo dragon lizard have been found. Some of these creatures have measured 15 or 20 feet long. And when you see how fierce these creatures look, you'd understand why not too many people live on that island. Now, when you look at animals of that kind and recognize these were not discovered until the year 1912, could there have been other animals living on the earth since the time of the flood that have actually been seen by men? Animals that we call in our modern language dinosaurs? Yet why is it when you go to the museums of the world, you see displays like this that insist all of the terrible lizards have become extinct millions of years ago? Is that true? The word dinosaur means terrible lizard. But then what do you do with another discovery? Did you realize that over the last few decades, scientists in the Congo in Africa have been on a serious search? Their quest? Dinosaurs, dead or alive. Why is that? Well, for many years, the pygmy people of that region have claimed that there is a large animal living in the swamp-infested interior of the Congo. They say this animal is something like half elephant and half dragon. They call it Mokelium bembe. They insist that it's there. They say that there's a whole family of them. In fact, if you saw a movie a few years ago called Baby, you understand a little bit about the story. And even though that story was made up, it was based on factual material. Now, a number of years ago, some of the men of the tribe there managed to spear a Mokelium bembe to death. And then they all sat down and had Mokelium bembe steak dinner. But then sadly, all of the men who partook of the dinner died. We don't know what it was that caused their death, but one thing is certain. These tribal people are absolutely certain that these animals exist. And they describe them as an animal that doesn't fit the pictures of any other modern living creature that we can throw at them. They insist that this is an animal that would be like what we would call a dinosaur. Now, they think that the Western scientists are absolutely nuts for going looking after this thing because they think there's some kind of a curse on it. Can you imagine what the discovery of a living brontosaurus would do to that chart? Well, unfortunately, it probably wouldn't do a whole lot. Remember the coelacanth? And there have been other creatures that we thought were extinct that are often referred to as living fossils once they're discovered, and the chart prevails. By the way, when it comes to the study of the extinction of the dinosaurs, there have been all sorts of different theories about why they died out. Dinosaurs, as big as they were, it seems that they would be very capable to survive. Why did they suddenly become extinct? Now, we need to face one fact. We don't have any evidence to prove absolutely that they are extinct. I know that seems a little radical to say, but the only way you could absolutely prove that dinosaurs are extinct is if you could see every part of the earth simultaneously. And we don't know that. New creatures that we didn't even know existed keep showing up from time to time. Nevertheless, the study of dinosaur extinction has promoted all sorts of very interesting ideas. One theory proposed that the dinosaurs died out because the rats, which were the largest mammals of that time, millions of years ago, went around and ate up all of the dinosaur eggs. Of course, we recognize that the rats could certainly have been stomped on by the dinosaurs, and there's no reason at all to believe that rats would be effectively capable of eliminating the dinosaurs. They don't generally buy that theory anymore. Maybe the brains of the dinosaur kind were too small. Some people think that the dinosaurs were just too stupid to continue to live, but they seem to manage quite fine on the brains that they did have all the time that they did exist. So they don't buy that theory much anymore either. Maybe overweight was the problem. Some have suggested that dinosaurs got so heavy as they foraged for food, they got slipped discs in their backs, and they all died of back trouble. Well, they've come up with some pretty imaginative ideas about why the dinosaurs became extinct. In 1946, one paleontologist suggested that a worldwide heat wave of just 2 degrees above normal would have baked all of the male dinosaur sex organs. And of course, with mass sterility setting in, it wouldn't be long before every last dinosaur died without heirs. Well, what do you think? One paleontologist suggested, in all sincerity, that the dinosaurs may very well have died out because of a mass case of constipation. Well, they've come up with some pretty radical ideas, and now Time magazine comes out and says, did comets kill the dinosaurs? Comets? Well, that's quite a switch. They're suggesting that a tremendous comet or some other astronomical body came out of the sky at 50,000 miles an hour, slammed into the earth, kicked up a tremendous dust cloud, darkened the atmosphere, the temperature dropped, and all the dinosaurs died of frostbite or something like that. But when you consider what the globe-rocking implications of such a catastrophe would be, it's no wonder that Time magazine said that this new theory could shake the foundations of evolutionary biology. The implications are staggering. But in the very end of the Time magazine article, recognizing how all these various theories of the extinction of dinosaurs have come and gone, the editor inserted a comment which I thought was very much worth looking at. It says, all of the fanciful concepts fail to account for the hundreds of other species that perished at the end of the Cretaceous. The problem, one professor said, is not what killed the dinosaurs, but what killed almost all the life at the time. Did you get that? Why didn't I ever hear that when I was in school? The whole race of every creature on earth suddenly wiped out. And then, in very skillful, though misleading editorial style, Time magazine's article concludes with this statement: maybe there just wasn't enough room for them on the ark. You know, I'm sure everybody in Time magazine expected that their readers would get quite a laugh out of that. But maybe they're a little closer to the truth than they would like to admit. Because all of these various theories have failed. Is it possible that the dinosaurs became extinct largely because of the changes that occurred at the time of the flood? Now, some people say the ark was a small object, but let's recognize that the ark was not small at all. This is a model of the ark, and we need to recognize that the Bible gives us some indications of how big it was. 45 feet high, 75 feet wide, and 450 feet long. At least 1.5 times the length of a football field. There was so much space on the ark that you could fit 50,000 animals the size of a sheep. That would more than take care of all the various kinds of creatures that would necessarily have to be on board the ark in order to survive the flood. Of course, all the animals that lived in the sea wouldn't go on the ark. Only the ones that lived on the dry land, and specifically the ones in which were the breath of life. On the ark, there was about 1.5 million cubic feet of space. There was plenty of room. Some people ask, well, was there room for the dinosaurs? Well, let's think about that for a moment. Dinosaurs, some of them lived in the water. Many of them lived on the dry land. Yeah, they probably went on the ark. But does that mean that Noah would have had to take the largest of them? We know the dinosaurs start out as small guys. Why couldn't they have been on board the ark as adolescents? And just because they survived the flood on the ark, did that mean that they would be guaranteed survival from then on? We recognize that many animals have become extinct, and especially when we recognize the terrific change in the environment following the flood. It's possible that there was a reduction in the barometric pressure. That is, the pressure of the atmosphere is less now than it was before the flood. That would have contributed greatly to the demise of very many large beasts, particularly the dinosaurs. When we think of all the other things concerning the way our atmosphere is, the way our soil, our climate, our whole environment is now compared to what it was like before the flood, we recognize why so many creatures would have had a greater struggle for survival. When you look at these ideas, these facts, these observations, doesn't it become clear again that maybe we're not seeing the whole picture? A lot of the information that we've been taught over the years, what are the full implications? Is there information, both biblically and scientifically, that will help us to have a better perspective? And as we go out and look at the world, as Job said, speak to the earth. What does it tell us? Does the Bible give us some insight? Do the fossils, the study of things like these footprints and other fossils that we've looked at, help us to understand what has happened to this earth in the past? Well, I'm sure as we continue our study of dinosaurs, and particularly on this very controversial subject of the Paluxy River, that we're going to find some amazing information that most of us have not been exposed to because we've we've leaned heavily on the secular sources of information. But take the time to prove all things. Speak to the earth and let it teach you. The things that are made declare the absolute power and nature of God Himself. In this particular session, we're going to be looking at some fascinating things having to do with fossils, dinosaurs, and some real adventure. And most of the material that we're covering in the series is found in the book, Unlocking the Mysteries of Creation. A number of years ago, when I lived in Canada, I was out hiking along the Saskatchewan River one day, and I jumped over a clump of sagebrush and landed on a great big fossil dinosaur bone. That got my attention, and I've always been excited about fossils. But when I looked at bones like these and dinosaur fragments that we've seen in a number of places around the country, it certainly alerts our curiosity, especially wondering how they got there, what fossilized them, what kind of animals did they come from, and what was the world like that they lived in. Over the years, I've been privileged to be able to collect a number of fossils, and I'd like to show some of those fossils to you in our session together. This is a fossil of a dinosaur vertebrae, and it came from Montana. It's been said that this is a tailbone out of a Tyrannosaurus rex. Now, if you go to some of the museums and identify a Tyrannosaurus rex in the museum, look at some of the vertebrae of the tailbones, and maybe you'll see some that are similar to this. Of course, some of the vertebrae higher up in the animal are much, much bigger than that. We look at these creatures and we see some pretty amazing, distinctive characteristics about them. Petrified wood is also a fascinating thing to look at. This piece came from Alberta, Canada, and it was found in the middle of a coal seam. It's solid wood, but it's solid stone. Well, it isn't wood now, but yet there's coal in it. Here in this knot, it's turned to coal. Now, you see, something has happened. It's changed. It's greatly changed. It's all mineralized. Yet, I'm told that if you were to slice through this and remove all of the mineral, there would still be particles of the actual wood remaining. Now, that's true in some cases of fossils, but not in all of them. Here's another fossil of a petrified clam. This clam has been completely replaced. It's been replaced by a kind of stone that is high in iron content. And here is another couple of clams where you see the two clams have actually been forced together upon one another. Now, they're all fused together, and they're fused of solid ironstone. It's very heavy. Now, whether you're looking at the clams or at the petrified wood or at the dinosaur bone, there's one thing that becomes very apparent. They had to be buried quickly. How fast do you bury a dinosaur and preserve it? Well, you can't do it a shovelful at a time. In order to preserve these bones with the high degree of detail that they have been preserved, they had to be completely overwhelmed and buried, locking off all the oxygen and allowing them to be petrified. Now, the subject of petrification is something that we'll perhaps be able to cover in yet another study together. But for now, let's just observe something, and that is the rapidity with which these things had to be buried. You look at a piece of petrified wood. This thing had no time to rot or decay. Every detail of the fiber of the wood, even the ring structure of the tree, as well as the knots, have been preserved. In fact, in a few places I found petrified leaves, and those leaves sometimes have been found impressed by the same kind of ironstone material. Now, this couple of clams helps us to realize that these clams didn't even have enough time to die a proper death. Because you know, when clams die, they open up. They relax that hinge muscle. But these clams didn't do that. In fact, most of the clams that we find fossilized by the millions around the world are found in this kind of a condition, closed, indicating that they were buried instantly, overwhelmed by a flood. Now, There are many other kinds of interesting fossils that we could look at. Here is a fossil of the similar kind of ironstone encasing a piece of wood. Now, I bring these to your attention just to perhaps spur your interest in looking at fossils, and not just what the fossil is, whether it's a clam or a piece of wood or a dinosaur bone, but the condition of its burial. We've been privileged to travel to places like Canada and Alberta or Texas, and we see a number of very interesting things that help us to understand what was responsible for the burial of these creatures in the past. You know, through most of our upbringing educationally, we're told that millions of years ago the dinosaurs lived on the earth. And they died out, sometimes they say slowly. More recently they've been saying that it's some kind of a rapid upheaval that caused the death of the dinosaurs. But whatever, the point of it is that the evidence for millions of years just does not exist. That is a fabrication of evolutionary theorizing. And when we go out and look at the evidence, we see tremendous deposits of flood-deposited rock strata, neatly laid on one another. Now, for example, when you go to the Grand Canyon, I want to share and clarify something that is sometimes confusing to a lot of people. Some people look at the Grand Canyon and they say, wow, did it take a lot of time to carve that canyon? While others would stand at the edge of the canyon and say, wow, did that take a lot of water to cut that canyon? Consider a couple of things. First of all, the depositing of the layers. Each of the layers in the Grand Canyon, like in many other parts of the world, and when I say many, I mean just about most of the places in the world are overlaid with layer after layer of sedimentary rock. These layers, when you notice, are laid neatly on top of each other. Oh, sometimes they're contorted and twisted, but we need to recognize that to lay layers of sedimentary deposited rocks neatly on top of each other allows no time for the erosion of the layer beneath when the next layer is deposited. Each layer is laid nicely on top of the other layers for a sequence that extends, in some cases, for thousands of feet. Well, when you find all of those nice, neat pancake layers stacked on top of each other, one thing is clear. They had to be deposited at the same time, essentially, one right after the other, while the sediments were still soft. That's particularly noticeable when you see that those layers have been bent up. In order for layers, one on top of the other, to be together bent up, they had to be still moist and soft. Because you know, if there was an earthquake that shattered the layers, if they were already hard, they would have all crumbled and cracked. Of course, that didn't happen. We do see slips and cracks. We see fault lines where layers and sequences of layers have slipped. But when we see something like the Grand Canyon, we see that these layers are on top of one another. In some places they are moved together. Some places they are slumped. Huge layers, hundreds of feet thick sometimes, have been seen slumped, indicating that they were laid down very rapidly. The fossil evidence that's found in those layers is another strong indication of rapid, catastrophic burial. Now, we talked in the session before this about some very controversial evidence about the existence of dinosaurs with mankind. We need to recognize the idea of a vast separation of millions of years between dinosaurs and man is a myth of evolution. It is not the evidence of science. When we go out and look at things as they really are, that's what science is supposed to be about. What do we find? We find evidence historically as well as scientifically that dinosaurs may very well have lived on this earth at the same time as man. I'd like to refer you to a very fascinating book called The Great Dinosaur Mystery. If you haven't run across this book yet, you're in for a real treat, because in it are documented a number of sources from around the world where people have seen historically dinosaur-type creatures. Now, the word dinosaur is a fairly modern invention, but in ancient times, since the time of the flood, societies of people from China to Egypt have recognized large reptilian beasts. Now, the reason that they do not seem to survive to today may be very clear. When we consider the tremendous difference in the environment before the flood and how much it has changed now, it stands to reason why the largest of creatures on the dry land would have difficulty surviving. You know, the largest creature that ever lived on the earth is still alive today. And of course, we know that the largest creature that ever lived is the whale. But the largest land animal is the dinosaur. Now, I'd like to talk to you for a moment about some of the evidence that has been found at the Paluxy River in Texas. This is the place where dinosaur tracks have been found in abundance, as they've been found in a number of places on Earth. Here you're looking at a plastic that is a styrofoam casting of the dinosaur track. Now, there was an initial casting made in plaster or some kind of a rubber material, and then this casting was made of that. So we have a positive impression similar to the actual impression that's found in the layers of the rock. Now, we have no trouble at all identifying that this indeed is a dinosaur track. You see the three toes? And it's quite long. It looks like it's about 20 inches long from the toe to the heel. The three big toes here. Now, nobody's ever seen a dinosaur make a track, but we have no difficulty at all in understanding that that must be a dinosaur track. And they're found abundantly, especially along the Paluxy River in Texas. Dr. Carl Baugh has done extensive research at the Paluxy River over the last 10 years. He has spent a lot of time looking and discovering and probing for more information, especially along these layers where there have been reported not only dinosaur tracks, but human tracks. Now, these human tracks, or shall we say alleged human tracks, have often brought a lot of criticism because they're found next to the dinosaur tracks. And standard evolutionary teaching insists that you cannot have dinosaur tracks and human tracks in the same strata. But we need to observe some things about the human foot. Now, what you're looking at now is a human foot track. I ought to know, I saw the man make it in mud. Yes, this is just a mud track. Now, it doesn't look well defined, but if you look at it from another angle, you'll see the clear evidence that this is a human foot. You'll notice where the ball of the foot was. You'll notice the great toe. You'll also notice the arch of the foot and the rounded heel section. All of these details show evidence of a human foot. Yet, if you looked at this track, not knowing it was human, and especially if it had hardened and eroded a little bit, you wouldn't know what it is at all. In fact, you might suppose that it might be some kind of other animal. I have to catch myself when I say other animal. It kind of shows how I've been brought up, doesn't it? We've all been brought up to consider other animals as compared to human. Friend, we're not an animal. We're totally and distinctively human, made in the image of God. But here you look at the impression of the human foot. You'll notice some very interesting highlights that are not found in any other foot. When you find a footprint like this one, made in sticky mud, you'll see details that are very clear. For example, the second toe of the human foot does not depress as deeply into the mud as the rest of the toes. It's the weakest of all your 5 toes. And thus, because it rides on the strength of your great toe, it won't depress very deeply. And if you found a human footprint, that would be a key characteristics to let us know that we're looking at a human foot. If you were to reach down and touch your foot on the outside edge, you'd notice there's a bulge there. It's produced by the 5th metatarsal bone that extends and causes the fatty tissue of the foot to protrude slightly outward. Now that's a characteristic found in the human foot, but it's not found in any other foot. This and all the other characteristics that we've looked at are special characteristics of the human foot found repeatedly in these human-looking tracks at the Paluxy River. They're fossilized, but the skeptics keep insisting that this could no way be a representation of human existence at the time of the dinosaurs. It's interesting what they say. If the foot looks too good, or the footprint looks too good, then they say it must be a fake. It must have been the creative work of ancient Indians. Or if it isn't good enough, they'll say it must be erosional marks. But when you find these kinds of tracks over and over again, what do you say? Now, let's look at something else. This track that you're looking at is the track of a broad-footed mammal. Some say it is a bear. It has claws. It has 5 toes. It is not like a human foot at all, but no matter what it is, it's not a dinosaur track. And it's not the kind of thing that you would have expected if evolution were true either, because the largest mammal that supposedly had existed, at least in evolutionary terms, back with the dinosaurs, was a rat. And this is no rat track. Now, they've even found other curious tracks. Here you're looking at a cat track, a very large cat track. There's no mistaking what kind of a track this is. Fossilized in the same limestone found in that same vicinity with the dinosaur tracks. Now, all of these are claimed to be what is called Cretaceous, about 100 million years old. Now, they aren't 100 million years old, but the evolutionists insist they are. And that's why they cannot allow for the existence of any higher mammals, so-called, at the time of the dinosaurs, because there wasn't time for them to have evolved yet, supposedly. There are lots of other interesting evidences that come from the Paluxy River. One day, a few years ago, when a large ledge of limestone rock was being moved out of the way, in a location that is pointed out here, it was very fascinating to see what was discovered. Now, these kinds of expeditions are done frequently. Ledges are moved out of the way. There's often a clay, what they call a marl, underneath the rock. And in this particular example, a little black object was found. It was hard and shiny, and it wasn't recognized immediately, but when it was taken out, it was identified, and it appeared to be a tooth that looked human. And everybody who looked at it said it looks like a human tooth. Even dental experts saw it and identified it as a human tooth. It has the incisor edge. It has the concave back side of the tooth. It has even the pulp cavity of a human tooth. Here you're seeing a picture of it beside a tooth that fell out of a little boy's mouth. And it's the same kind of arrangement. Now, it's interesting that some of those same experts that looked at that tooth, once they found out where it came from, said, well, it couldn't be a human tooth, it must be a fish tooth. Now, why would they say that it must be a fish tooth without further testing? Because it was found in layers of sedimentary rock associated with dinosaur remains, particularly these footprints. Now, we don't know exactly what kind of a tooth it was. In fact, tests are continuing to be done on it. It may prove to not be a human tooth, but the point is clear that because of where it was found, even though everything about it looked human, there was a frame of mind in people's thoughts that made some people think, well, it's got to be something else other than what it appears to be. The Paluxy River does indeed continue to offer us evidence that make us think. And as continuing expeditions go on there, I'm sure we'll be very excited to hear of what has been found. Some scientists around the world have said that the things that are being discovered there may be more earth-shaking to concepts of science and origins than even Darwin's theory itself. But the idea of human foot tracks is not so far-fetched in the fossil record. What you're looking at now is a picture of a human set of fossil foot tracks. They were found in Nicaragua. This picture was published in a secular textbook. And when I saw this, I noticed something. They said it was 5,000 years old. This is hardened volcanic ash. And when I looked at it, I thought, it's a good thing they didn't find some kind of a stegosaurus foot track nearby, or they probably never would have published those human tracks in that book. We're going to look at some other evidences that come from the Paluxy River and find some exciting details that are often not told in the secular media. South of Fort Worth, Texas, is a sleepy little town called Glen Rose. Every once in a while, newsmen and scientists come from all over the country to see continuing discoveries that are being made there. Along the river called the Paluxy, there have been many interesting fossil discoveries over the years. A few years back, the state of Texas decided to set aside a parcel of land whereby they would protect some of these rather interesting fossils, these dinosaur foot tracks. Now, they've built a little visitor center to explain something about the evolutionary story of the dinosaurs. Of course, not a word is said in this visitor center about the existence of these controversial human tracks, which makes us kind of wonder, why don't they even want to address the issue? Everybody in town knows that these tracks have been there for years. They've seen them over the years. But in the state park, not a word is whispered about them. Not very far away, just a mile or so down the road, is the Creation Evidences Museum. Dr. Carl Baugh began this courageous attempt to expose some of the misinformation that's been going on over the years by instituting this new museum effort. Now, when it began some 8 or 9 years ago, it was just a small exhibit. And over the years, more and more things have been added. I'd like to show you some of the fascinating things that have been included in this exhibit, which you can stop in and see on your way to the Dinosaur State Park owned by the state of Texas. What you're looking at here is a track that was taken out of the riverbed some 40 or 50 years ago. Now, this track, which is that same limestone rock, is made out of what they call Cretaceous material. It's claimed to be 100 million years old. Yet in it is a foot track that looks very human. How'd you like to have a man like that on your football team or on your basketball team? Now, this track is about a size 24. And when you look at it, you say that, well, it looks awfully human. The skeptics recognize that and say, it's got to be a fake. Now, over the years, because of most of the tracks being not as perfect as this one, they say that this one, which is so perfect, must surely be a fake. It can't be real. It can't be a genuine human track. They said that if you cut through it, it would prove once and for all that there is no evidence of compression or compaction. I have with me a model that is an exact replica of that very track. I want you to just notice something. The width may seem wide to you, but if you walked barefoot all of your life, then that track would be very similar to the kind of track you'd make. Now, it is longer than most of our tracks today, but it is not as long as some of the people who are on football teams today. So they say that's too perfect, and it's found in supposedly 100-million-year-old strata. So they said to prove it, cut through it. So the cutting was done. You can see the evidence here, even on the replica, of where the cuts were made. And, of course, right where you'd expect them to be, the evidence for compaction was found. Now, there are some interesting details that we could look at more to show you that compaction. We don't have the time to do it here, but I'd certainly like to recommend very highly for your investigation a little book called Dinosaur, Scientific Evidence that Dinosaurs and Man Walked Together. It's by Dr. Carl Baugh, and in it he shows full-color pictures of all sorts of interesting evidences relating to the Paluxy River. It's something that you really ought to try to pick up. If you can't find it in the store, you could certainly order it from the Creation Resource Foundation. A few years ago in Utah, a skeleton was discovered. It was in the process of being bulldozed away in a layer of sedimentary sandstone. Now, there was a man on the scene who recognized that this was a significant discovery, and before the thing was totally ruined, he stopped the operations of the bulldozing and went in and carefully removed the bones. Here you're seeing the skeleton before it was completely taken out of the stone. He brought in men from the press, brought in men from the university, and they watched as this human skeleton was completely removed. Everything about it was human. They were not saying that this was some sort of a pre-human. It was indeed a human skeleton. The bones were taken to the university and a couple of weeks passed. It was expected that there would be some great report announced to the world of a discovery of an ancient human skeleton found in Utah, but nothing was said. Finally, the man who was responsible for finding the thing had to go to the university and gather up his bones and take them home. Why wasn't anything announced? Well, on checking, they found that that particular layer of sandstone, according to the charts, was laid down 100 million years ago. And of course, every evolutionist knows that you can't find human remains in sandstone that was deposited 100 million years ago. And so they just ignored it. Is that what we do with the evidence when it doesn't fit our theory? Ignore it. You see, the evolutionists say that man could not have lived 100 million years ago. But if 100 million years are a fabrication of evolutionary thinking, then that puts a whole different perspective on it, doesn't it? That skeleton is on display, as you see here, at the Creation Evidences Museum near Glen Rose, Texas, as are a number of other interesting, fascinating discoveries. I'd like to point out to you something that was discovered a few years ago. Right along the bank of the Paluxy River, quite a sizable strata of rock exists. It's crumbly sandstone and clay, and in this material was found a dinosaur skeleton. Now that was significant in that for years the evolutionists said, well, you'll never find dinosaur skeletons where dinosaur footprints were found. Now the skeleton of this dinosaur gives us evidence that the event responsible for preserving the foot tracks was also responsible for overwhelming at least some dinosaurs and burying them in that place. Interestingly, too, those dinosaur bones have been subjected to some carbon dating tests, and some preliminary evidence indicates that there is carbon-14 present, enough to indicate that they cannot be millions of years old at all, but only thousands of years old. What do you do with this? What you're looking at is a fossil of a hammer. It is encased in sandstone. The head of the hammer is made of iron. The handle of the hammer extending downward is wood. The outside of it is still fibrous wood, but the inside of it has turned to stone. Actually, crystals are there in the center of that wooden handle. When you look at this little hammer, some very interesting things have been observed about it. First of all, this iron-headed hammer is not made of an alloy that is typically made today. In fact, this alloyed iron has no carbon in it, yet it is very hard and is very difficult for it to corrode at all. It doesn't have any silicon in it. That is not typical. for iron alloys found today. Yet it has a little over 2% chlorine in it. Chlorine alloyed with iron, that is not something that we find typical today. It can be done. In fact, only recently have scientific methods been worked out to alloy chlorine with iron. But here, seeing this hammer, you look at it, find it encased in stone, and ask, where did it come from? Well, it came from a strata of rock that has been called 400 million years old, Ordovician, according to the evolutionary chart. No, it's not 400 million years old, but that strata was not deposited 400 million years ago. What you're looking at may very well be a man-made artifact made before the flood and deposited by the sedimentary strata laid down during the time of the flood. Now, continuing tests are being done on that hammer, but I want you to recognize something. Some evolutionists have gotten so irritated by the existence of this artifact. I know of one who said if they could get their hands on it, they would destroy it. Do you see why such evidence is absolutely damaging to the theory of evolution? There are many other evidences that continue to be found not only at the Paluxy River, but in other parts of the world. And maybe you heard of some of them. I would like to refer you again to a book that we mentioned before, a book that is called Ancient Man, a handbook of puzzling artifacts. Now, this book is filled with all sorts of anomalous fossils. Now, what does that mean? Something that doesn't fit. Well, it doesn't fit the usually accepted theories about the origin of man. There are other things that I've found around the country in the last few years of my travels where people have said that they've found things in coal that weren't supposed to be there. Coal is supposed to have been laid down, according to the evolutionary picture, 100 million years ago. Yet, man-made objects have been found encased in coal. That means that those objects were laid down at the same time that the coal was laid down. Not 100 million years ago, but at the same time as the whole earth was totally destroyed by a worldwide flood. Now, you see, when we talk about a flood, we talk about catastrophism. There's a lot of information that deals with that subject, and yet in another seminar, Volume 2 of Unlocking the Mysteries of Creation, we'll cover the subject of catastrophism and the global flood in much, much more detail. The subject of coal would certainly be one of the subjects that we would address. We need to realize that we have been so flooded with evolutionary thinking. Our worldview tends to be millions of years. Our worldview tends to separate man from dinosaurs by millions of years. But when we go out and look at the evidence, isn't it only fair that we do what Job advised us to do? Speak to the earth and let it teach us. The more we investigate and the more we are willing to prove everything, then we will find evidence that we should not be ashamed at all to uncover. Remember, God himself is the one who invites us to prove all things. That verse is found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21. He encourages us to go out and look at it. Here I had the idea at one time in the past that if you're going to be a Christian, if you're going to believe the Bible, you've got to unplug your brain. That is not the truth. God is the one who tells us all to go out and investigate it, look at it, find out what the real evidence proves about the origin of things, the origin of man, about what happened to man, about what happened to this earth in the past. As we continue on in our study, we're going to look at the evidence, or I should say, at the lack of evidence, to support what evolutionists have been forcing on us for decades. So keep looking, speak to the earth, because the things that are made declare the power of God and the nature of God.